I was going to have a fire the other day, so I ran over to go get some firewood. When I realised I only had this one piece left, and it was quite a big piece. When I put it inside my fire pit and went to light it, it wasn't catching. I needed to get some smaller pieces. And I had to think, what should I do? That's when I realised, oh, I'll just get my axe and cut it up. So I ran back over to where I keep the wood, and that's when I realised, I don't have an axe. So today, that's what I'm going to try and solve. I'm going to be making an axe. So the first thing I'm going to make is the handle. You see, I wanted to make everything, including the handle and the axe head. So I got this piece of wood, drew out a shape, and clamped it to the table. I put this fabric over the top so then I wouldn't mark the wood with the clamps. Now with cutting it out, I'm going to be using a grinder because I only have two tools, and that's a grinder and a drill. So I got to work, starting to grind it out. It actually didn't take as long as I thought. This project had a lot of firsts for me. It was the first time I ever made something out of wood, and it was the first time I ever used resin. After cutting out the initial shape, it was time to round over the edges to make it more handle-like, and then it was to cut off the rest of the wood that we wouldn't be using. Now while you watch me make the handle, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who subscribed. Unfortunately, I did not hit my target of 500 subscribers by the end of the year, but that's okay. Next year, I'm going to be moving the goalpost and I'm going to make it 1,000 subscribers by the end of next year. I think we can do it. We still got a whole year ahead of us, and I think it's doable. Anyway, back to the making. It was time to cut off the excess piece of wood. So I got up my handsaw, cut it away, and here was the handle. It wasn't quite finished yet. I still had to deal with the very end, and to do that, I was just going to do the same as I did before, sand it away, but making sure to make it a bit thicker so you could tell it's the head of the handle, and also to give more room for the resin to attach to it. After that was done, I gave it a quick sand down all over just to make it a bit smoother. It didn't need it, but I wanted to do it just in case. And here's the handle, and we're ready to move on. Alright, now since I finished making the handle, it's up to the scariest part of it all, and that is pouring the resin. Now to pour the resin, we need to make a mold. So I got out this sheet of plastic and went to drawing the shape of my axe. Now here's where I made a bit of a problem. You see, this is a very hard plastic, and I didn't know what plastics I could use as my mold, as I've never used resin before, and I really should have chose a lighter plastic because this thing was so hard to cut. I spent maybe 3 hours trying to cut it, and when I finally cut it down, I had to clean up the edges to make it waterproof. Now thanks to an awesome friend who's used resin before, they told me how to roughen up the wood so then the resin would stick to it better. And now it was time to connect all the pieces of the mold together. I got out my hot glue gun and I used way too much hot glue. I ended up using 2 packets, but I really wanted to make it waterproof, because if that started leaking everywhere, I'd be in big trouble. Now before pouring the resin, I had to put on the correct PPE, which are gloves, a face mask and goggles. I'm not entirely sure if you need the goggles, but I wore them just in case. Better be safe than sorry. You see, I've never worked with resin before and I wasn't entirely sure how to do it, but after reading the instructions it said to just not measure by weight, but measure by volume. Unfortunately I didn't have any measuring cups, so I drew a line and eyeballed it. That's probably not the smartest way, but it was my only choice. After mixing the resin together, I then added 2 drops of paint and mixed that in. It's very important you mix the resin before you add the paint. And now it was time to make the first pour. I poured it in very gently, making sure to not make many bubbles. Now you're supposed to get a torch and pop all the bubbles, but unfortunately I didn't have one. I then went and got this tub and put it over the top. The reason is I don't want any dust landing on it. Left it to dry for 24 hours and then took it off. But here is where I made a bit of a mistake, purely a timing mistake. I did this all on the wrong days, meaning I poured one layer and had to leave it to rest for 2 days because I just didn't have time to come back and pour the next layer. Anyway, eventually after 6 days, it was finally time to get to cutting. Now with cutting this, first I had to take it out of the mold, which sounds a lot easier than said. But no, this was a nightmare. I probably spent about half an hour smashing at it with hammers, trying to get all the pieces off. And eventually I did get it off and it was time to cut it. Before cutting it, I just quickly wanted to redraw the axe head, so then I knew exactly where I was cutting. Now remember earlier where I said I only had a grinder and a drill? Well, this made this next part extremely difficult. You see, when I was using the grinder, it was making the dust super fine and I didn't feel like making a mess. After doing the back of the axe, I realized this was a horrible idea, so I wanted to switch to just cutting it with a disc, which didn't really work. So I went to a handsaw, which did work, but it took so long and I kept having to cut it at funny angles. I was also a little worried that putting so much pressure on the axe head would snap it right off the handle. But the resin had quite a bit of give and it didn't break, so I was quite happy. I mean, I had a backup plan if I did snap it off. I was just going to use a little bit more resin to glue it back on. Anyway, I also used a screwdriver as a bit of a chisel. I kept bouncing between all three tools, the grinder, the screwdriver, and the handheld saw until I got all the pieces off. Before calling the axe good, there were two things left to do. First was sand away all of the big jagged pieces, and then it was polish it. With sanding, first I started with the grinder and then went on to handheld sandpaper. This took a very long time. I had to sand the entire thing. Unfortunately, it wasn't going to be see-through at the end as I didn't have an electric sander. After sanding it all down, it was time to polish it. I went and got car polish because apparently you can just use car polish. I had to make sure the axe was wet when polishing it. After polishing it, it was done and I could call it good. I was so happy with how the axe looked. It reminded me something out of Game of Thrones. It looked like something the White Walkers would have. It looked mythical and out of this world and I was so happy with how it looked. There was only one thing left to do, and that was to test how well it would cut. But before that, I just want to show the axe just in case this thing shatters when it hits the wood. Here it is, all done. Now if there was one thing I would change is I would have oiled the handle, but I didn't realize that until now. Anyway, now it's time to cut it. So I lined up my wood and I went to cut it. Unfortunately, it just started chipping the tip. So I stopped cutting it because I didn't want to break the axe. I guess I won't be having my fire after all. Thanks for watching.